The Swiss Alps in November aren't a place for the faint of heart or for the poorly equipped. Our company was a study in grim efficiency, a small, tightly wound coil of men wrapped in heavy wool and camouflage, all of us counting the days until we could return to a world where we didn't have to sleep in canvas tents pitched on frozen ground. The first snow had fallen a week prior, a soft, silent blanket that had since hardened into a slick, unforgiving crust. The air was a constant, biting reminder of our vulnerability, and the mountains, usually a postcard-perfect backdrop, felt more like a cage than a vista. We were there for skill training, a fact that baffled every single one of us. There were no tactical maneuvers, no simulated combat, just endless days of drilling and re-drilling the fundamentals: navigation, field first aid, and basic communication. And yet, for some reason known only to the high command, we were required to maintain a full 24/7 armed guard. It was an absurdity that had become a running joke among the ranks. Because everyone knows, Private Keller had muttered into his coffee that morning, how dangerous the Swiss Alps are at 3,000 meters. The marmots will get you if the sheer cliffs don't. I was the medic, a role I hadn't asked for, but had been assigned due to a semester of pre-med courses I'd taken before being conscripted. It made me a person of interest only when someone had a sprained ankle or a bad case of the flu, which in that environment was a surprisingly frequent occurrence. My own nights were a broken, miserable affair, spent dozing fitfully in a sleeping bag that seemed to offer more moral support than actual warmth. The night of the incident was no different. The silence of the mountains was profound, a heavy, suffocating stillness only broken by the distant, rhythmic crunch of a guard's boots on the snow. It was a silence so complete that the faintest sound could feel like an assault. That's why the shouting, when it came, was so violent. It started with a single guttural yell, a sound ripped from the throat of a man in shock or extreme pain. It wasn't a call for help. It was a pure, unadulterated cry of alarm. I was instantly awake, my heart hammering against my ribs. Before I could even sit up, a staccato burst of automatic gunfire tore through the air, echoing off the rock faces. With a terrifying percussive finality, it sounded like a full magazine, emptied in one desperate, chaotic spray. My tent flap was ripped open a moment later, and Sergeant Berger, my NCO, was shouting my name. "Medic! I need a medic now!" His voice was tight with urgency, the kind of tone that strips all humor from a situation. I scrambled out, my movements clumsy with sleep and cold, pulling on my boots with fumbling fingers. The cold hit me with the force of a physical blow, a slap to the face that instantly cleared the remaining fog from my mind. In the pale glow of the moon reflecting off the snow, the camp looked like a ghost town. Everyone still inside, huddled against the cold and fear. Berger was a dark, tense silhouette, pointing a trembling hand toward the guard post on the camp's perimeter. I ran, my medic bag thumping against my back, the icy air burning my lungs. I was expecting to find a man with a shattered leg, a gunshot wound, a victim of a freak accident. What I found was something else entirely. The guard post itself was empty. There was no one there, but about 10 feet away, starkly visible against the pristine white of the snow, was a stain. A dark, horrifyingly large puddle of blood, glistening faintly in the moonlight. I stopped dead in my tracks, the sight freezing me in place. The puddle was large enough to suggest a serious arterial wound, perhaps even a fatality. But where was the body? Where was the wounded man? I searched frantically, my head swiveling from side to side. There were footprints, scuff marks in the snow around the puddle, but nothing that suggested a person dragging themselves away. The trail of footprints led off into the woods, towards the darkness of the tree line and the steep drop-off to the valley below. Berger was right behind me, his rifle raised. "What do you see, DOC?" Is he dead? Where is he? I don't know, I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. There's blood. A lot of blood, but no one here. The next few hours were a maelstrom of confusion and frantic activity. The camp was roused. Radios crackled with frantic reports. A search operation was commenced immediately, the men forming a line and combing the area with flashlights, their beams cutting through the Pradong gloom. The air was thick with questions and a low, creeping fear. Who had been shot? Why was there so much blood? Where was the other guard? And what had happened at the post? It was only later, back in the relative safety of the main tent, that I got the full, bewildering story. Berger, having managed to calm down the second guard, a young private named Hans, had finally gotten an account of what had happened. Hans and his partner, a quiet, almost reclusive private named Klaus, had been on their rotation. The night was uneventful, cold, and boring. At around 3 a.m., Hans had told Klaus he was going to step into the trees for a moment to relieve himself. When he returned, what he saw made him freeze in the cold. Klaus was standing perfectly still in the middle of the clearing, his back to Hans, his silhouette stark against the white ground. But he wasn't wearing his uniform. He was butt naked. The only things on his body were his rifle, held loosely in one hand, and a small, folding army knife in the other. Hans, stunned, called out to him. Klaus didn't respond. Instead, he raised the knife and, with a strange, deliberate motion, sliced open his forearm. The blood, dark and shockingly vibrant, welled up and began to drip onto the snow. He didn't even flinch. Hans stood frozen in terror. He saw Klaus raise his rifle. He assumed he was about to be shot. Hans screamed, throwing his hands up in a desperate, last-second plea. But Klaus didn't turn the rifle on him. He pointed it straight up into the air and emptied the entire magazine in a single frenzied burst, the shots echoing off the mountains like a manic, thunderous applause. The noise was deafening, a brutal punctuation to the surreal scene. Then, he dropped the empty magazine, turned, and without a word, ran. He ran straight into the dark, snowy night, a naked, bloodied figure disappearing into the woods. The story was so bizarre, so utterly detached from reality, that a few of the men chuckled nervously. But the fear in Hans's eyes had been real, and the puddle of blood on the snow was a chilling, undeniable fact. The search continued for days, expanding to a massive operation involving the camp, local authorities, and even a helicopter. We combed every ridge, every gully, every inch of the surrounding forest, but we never found him, not a trace. No frozen body, no abandoned clothing, no sign of life. I suspected, and still do, that the blood and the theatrical display were a calculated performance, a way to fake his death and leave the army behind, perhaps to cross the border into Austria and start a new life. The Alps, after all, are a perfect place to get lost. And what better way to ensure no one followed than to present a scene so shocking and so confusing that it would delay any organized pursuit? But the image never left me. A man, standing naked in the freezing snow, sacrificing his own blood and sanity, all to become a ghost. A strange kind of freedom, bought with madness and a theatrical act of violence. We never spoke of him again, at least not in any official capacity. But sometimes, when the wind howled through the camp at night, I would hear the private joke from that morning echoing in my mind. Everyone knows how dangerous the Swiss Alps are ... And I would think of Private Klaus, a man who, in the cold, silent theater of the mountains, had decided to shed his uniform, his identity, and his sanity to become something else entirely. A man who became, for one night, the ghostly, bloody figure of Private Snow White.